my friends, welcome to FHP Books. I am Felix and today I would like to talk about Gialli, about Giallo movies, about this Italian version of thrillers, of suspense. The Gialli were very popular first as novels, as books, as literature. Around the 30s, 40s and also in the 50s there were published a lot of these detective stories in Italy by the publishing house Mondadori. And the covers of these books, the covers of these little detective novels were usually yellow. That's why popularly these detective novels became known in Italy as Gialli, which means yellow in Italian. Yellow, Giallo is singular and Gialli is the plural of Giallo. So these detective stories, these detective novels were known as Gialli in Italy, and they had a lot of similarities, they had a lot of things in common with what in the US is known as pulp fiction, as pulp literature that was also very popular in the US in the 20s, in the 30s, and that gave us great authors like, for instance, Robert Irving Howard, who was, by the way, in touch with Lovecraft, one of my favorite writers. By the way, also Robert Howard was the creator of Conan the Barbarian, of who I will talk also in another time. Anyway, in Italy, these Gialli books developed, were very popular in the 50s, and afterwards they came also to cinema. That was in part due to the success of Alfred Hitchcock, who was very successful at the time in the 50s with great movies like Vertigo, for instance, or Rear Window, and this kind of suspense movies. So the Gialli, the Italian Gialli, had its base in detective stories, in detective traditional whodunit detective murder mystery, like the stories by Agatha Christie, by George Simenon and other authors. These stories have usually a very similar structure. There is a killer, there is a murder, somebody gets killed, and then a detective, some investigator tries to resolve the case, is investigating the case. That's the plot of the story, that's the plot of the usual crime thriller, and at the end the policeman or detective or investigator gets the killer, and in between there are a series of suspects, suspicious people and so on, and they are investigated and so on and so forth. That's the usual structure in this kind of story, in books, in novels and also in movies. So in the Italian version of thrillers, in the Italian version of this crime mystery, of these detective stories that in Italy became known as Gialli, we also have this Hitchcock element, which involves also elements of psychothriller, of psychological thriller, because in most of the cases in these stories the directors, the scriptwriters, they explore also what is behind the motivation of the killer. There is usually some trauma, some traumatic experience that is rooted in the mind of the killer, and this is analyzed somehow in the thrillers of Hitchcock, in the Hitchcock inspired kind of thriller that became very popular in the 50s, and that were also included, this element was also included in Italian Giallo. So in Italian Giallo we have the habitual, usual police crime thriller of detective stories like Agatha Christie, and also included these psycho-thriller characteristics. Of course, psycho-thriller, the most well-known of Hitchcock, might be Psycho, but there are many more, as I told before, Vertigo, Rear Window, and so on. And this kind of filmmaking was influencing the Italian gialli very much. So one of the first directors who made gialli movies in Italy was Mario Bava. Mario Bava's first, most well-known giallo is La ragazza che sapeva troppo, which means the girl who knew too much. And actually even the title is a kind of reference to Hitchcock, because Hitchcock had done before the movie The Man Who Knew Too Much with James Stewart, among other actors. So Mario Bava inspired himself by Hitchcock, inspired himself by the detective pulp stories that were very popular in Italy with these yellow covers, and The Girl Who Knew Too Much was one of the first gialli that became famous in Italy and also internationally. In Italy, there were always some kind of trends, some kind of cinematic trends. In the 50s, there were the peplum genre, the peplum that was also known as sword and sandals, and this sword and sandals trend was inspired by the Hollywood movies that were done also about these old times, about the Roman times, about the Romans, and also about biblical stuff, about biblical stories in the 50s or in the beginning of the 50s or even before. We also have, for instance, Quo Vadis or Ben-Hur or Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor and so on. These were blockbusters, epic blockbusters that played in the ancient times, the Romans, the Egyptians, and so on. And then in Italy, the Italian version of that became the peplum, peplum, sword and sandals. Later, the Western came to Italy. The Western was also very popular, of course, in the United States, with directors like John Ford, with actors like John Wayne, and in Italy, this kind of genre was also adapted, Italo-Western, spaghetti Western, with directors like Sergio Leone, Sergio Corbucci, and so on. So after this trend of peplum and gialli, after this trend of peplum and Western, there came the trend of giallo, and giallo was the main Italian cinematic trend in the end 60s to the end 70s, I would say. It was like a decade, mostly the 70s. So peplum was the 50s, Western was the 60s, and gialli was the 70s. That's how we could more or less compare or set these kind of genres that were trendy in Italy at the time. And so Mario Bava, as I told you before, Mario Bava was the first Italian director who took this thriller and these psychological thriller elements into the detective genre. He could be considered the father of gialli. He also, before making gialli, Mario Bava was also doing some gothic horror stories that were inspired in British horror, in British classical horror of Hammer Productions, of the very well-known Hammer Productions, that adapted to the screen stories of vampires, of monsters, of zombies, and so on. The most well-known classic horror movies are from the 30s, like the movies starring Bela Lugosi as Dracula or Boris Karloff as the Frankenstein monster, and so on. But later in the 50s there were also very popular gothic horror movies with, for instance, Christopher Lee and other British actors, and Mario Bava was also influenced by that. So he was influenced, of course, by the detective stories, by Hitchcock, and by Gothic horror. So these three ingredients took form in his filmmaking and in the birth of the Giallo genre. The Giallo genre was born thanks to these three elements, and it developed more in the next times with other directors like Dario Argento, of whom I will talk about the next time. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you want to know more about Giallo, if you want to know more about this fascinating genre, about this very complete genre, if you want to have a filmic guide with reviews of the best well-known classic Gialli movies, and also of other masterpieces that are not so well known, and other Giallo themed movies that are also worth watching. Some of them are not so good, some of them are very good. It depends on the director, it depends on many factors. If you want to explore this genre more, and if you want to know more about this great Italian thriller style, don't hesitate to take a look at my book, All the Colors of Murder, which is available in Amazon. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you in the next time.